A man, a marker, a legend. Taki 183, real name Demetrius, was a Greek kid living in Washington Heights of northern Manhattan in the early 70s. He got into the habit of writing his nickname, Taki, and street number, 183, wherever he went, mainly around his neighborhood. Once he became a delivery boy, his tag became much more widespread, spanning all throughout Manhattan. Before long, the whole city knew about Taki 183, and many were emulating him by marking their own names. In July of 1971, the New York Times article Taki 183 Spawns Pen Pals was published, and graffiti in New York was on the rise. However, Taki 183 was not the first graffiti artist in America. Dating all the way back to the late 1800s, hobos traveling by trains would make writings of their own, called monikers, using chalk on the train cars. Kilroy was here, a moniker created by James J. Kilroy when he was riding the rails in the 1920s, ended up becoming a symbol of America during World War II when Kilroy was a soldier. Americans wrote it all over the world. Out in Philadelphia was the real beginning of graffiti, starting with cornbread in the late 1960s.
Here used to be a wall, the electric company. This is the very first wall I wrote on. I got the name of Reform School because I insisted that the cooks would bake some cornbread. The name cornbread had a ring to it. I got the name on the back of my shirt and I started writing it all over the halls of the juvenile institution. They would talk about my name all over the street, and that's exactly what happened. The more they talked, the more I wrote. The more they talked, the more I wrote.
As he did this, his name seemed to grow and grow and grow, and he just became a household name, more or less.
I went to the Philadelphia Zoo. I wrote on the concession stands. I wrote on the wall where the monkeys at, where the lions is at, on the park benches. I wrote cornbread lives on both sides of the elephant. I got locked up for that.
Philadelphia was one of the first cities to truly develop a graffiti scene, though it is oft overshadowed by New York City. In Philadelphia during the 1970s, the first ever gang created specifically for graffiti production was formed. They were called the Hip City Swingers. Prior to the Hip City Swingers, the dynamic between graffiti and gangs was different. Graffiti writers typically worked alone, and the only graffiti crews were formed from pre-existing gangs, usually to mark gang territory. After the Hip City Swingers, graffiti gangs went on to become a typical part of graffiti culture. Originally, graffiti was all about marking down your name. But with graffiti exploding in New York, competition to get noticed was rising. People started to create simple graphics to go along with their names, some famous examples being Stay High 149, Dead Leg 167, Staff 161, Tracy 168, and Blade. The New York City subway was truly the hub of graffiti. Even with the anti-graffiti bill signed by Mayor John Lindsay in 1973, graffiti didn't diminish, but rather grew bigger and bigger. Hondo was one of the first writers to create masterpieces, or large-scale graffiti paintings, on the outside of subway cars. Going even bigger than that, Queens writer Kane created almost exclusively whole cars. As their name suggests, whole cars are graffiti murals that take up an entire train or subway car. Another writer known for his whole cars was Lee. Lee stood out in this area because he was only 15 years old at the time, and because his pieces dealt with dark themes such as fear of death. The first ever graffiti crew to paint whole trains, up to 10 train cars at a time, were the Rock Stars of the Bronx in 1979. Throw-ups became common among writers who wanted to get a big image up fast. A throw-up is more prominent than a tag, but quicker to produce than a masterpiece. For many writers, particularly those with short names such as In, Pi, Oi, Pio, and even more versatile and famous writers like Is the Wiz, throw-ups were great. Bombings are essentially even faster versions of throw-ups. Bombers are writers who favor quantity over quality. The undisputed king of bombing in New York was Ja. Once the 1980s rolled around, graffiti started to get noticed by people in the fine arts world. Rhode Island School of Design administrator Jack Stewart met with and interviewed writers and took photographs of their work. He turned this project into an NYU doctoral dissertation. Another artist, Henry Chalfant, became intrigued with graffiti in the early 80s. He took photographs of graffiti, and later ended up meeting Days, Cal First, Mayor 149, Shy 147, and Crash, by chance. And these writers took interest in his photography. Chalfant paired up with photojournalist Martha Cooper, who had her own ties with the graffiti scene through writer Dondi. The two became some of the greatest allies of graffiti writers in a time period when graffiti wasn't considered an art form. Graffiti slowly but surely began to find its way into gallery shows, and art collectors ate it up. However, many writers who achieved great success on the streets were not successful in galleries, and vice versa. This created a rift in the writing community. The 1980s were a gritty time in New York City history. The AIDS epidemic, the crack epidemic, and the city going bankrupt were just a few of the problems. After 1985, graffiti fell to the wayside in the professional art world. Graffiti no longer had the same novelty as it once had. Many art collectors who once bought graffiti were now dying of AIDS. Buyers began to look elsewhere. Finally, with the stock market crash of 1987, there was little to no interest in commercial graffiti. Moving away from New York, let's take a look at some other cities. Philadelphia graffiti was an entity unto itself. Writers in Philly created unique writing styles, such as script, tall print, and wicket. With limited wall space, writers began climbing up. Graffiti pieces created in hard-to-reach places are known as heavens, and some of the first heavens showed up in Philadelphia. Philadelphia writing grew into a sort of hybrid of local styles and New York influences. Los Angeles was another entity unto itself. In fact, LA had a graffiti scene even before Philadelphia. With Mexican-American immigrants dominating the graffiti scene, they wrote in Cholo style, a unique form of script with heavy Mexican influence. With the popularization of New York style, many LA writers drifted from Cholo style. Many natives didn't want to abandon Cholo style, so, like Philadelphia, a hybrid of Cholo and New York was formed. Other cities developed graffiti scenes too. One notable example being Chicago. Writers in Chicago used graffiti as a way to escape having to be in a gang. Writing in Chicago included many unique practices. One of these practices was flipping, which was rivals writing each other's tag backwards or upside down. Some of the most famous and prominent graffiti writers came out of Chicago. Chicago's graffiti scene flourished in the 1980s, and the scenes in other cities began to rise too. New York writer Revolt brought graffiti to Baltimore when he moved there. Many New Jersey cities were exposed due to their close proximity to New York. Cleveland bore resemblance to the South Bronx. Boston developed its own scene, heavily influenced by strained race relations. Washington, D.C. graffiti was largely inspired by hip-hop music. The scene hit Miami because of New York kids going to visit their older relatives. Pittsburgh was influenced by Philly. Cities without subways, like San Francisco, took to writing on buses. Even as far out as Hawaii, where people painted in drainage ditches and on water towers. Graffiti exploded. With the graffiti movement running wild, the anti-graffiti movement was sure to begin. It started with the Anti-Graffiti Network in Philadelphia. Established in 1984, this organization was dedicated to buffing, or cleaning off, any graffiti, and encouraging young people to do something more productive. This organization was able to create prohibitions of selling spray paints to minors, as well as prohibitions of displaying unlocked cans of paint in stores. This organization proved futile, however, because there were far more writers than there were people who opposed them. Graffiti remained fairly prevalent. Other cities had hard crackdowns on graffiti as well. By the time the mid-1980s rolled around, Chicago officials were near constantly buffing. This caused a drastic decline in the quality and quantity of graffiti in Chicago. Later on, in the 1990s, the scene was revived. These anti-graffiti activists decided to hold a graffiti contest in an attempt to curb the criminal aspect of creating graffiti. But writers only entered the contest as a scam to get free paint from the city. The 1990s were a golden age for graffiti in many cities. Cities whose scenes were killed by penalization throughout the end of the 80s were revitalized in the 90s. Providence graffiti got huge in the 1990s. Multiple cities in New Jersey started to connect with one another and share styles. San Diego connected with San Francisco, largely due to writer Cray One. New York writers moved from subways to streets. Cincinnati had heavy LA influence, while Detroit and Milwaukee were influenced by Chicago. Richmond, Virginia reached an all-time graffiti high in 1997. New Orleans graffiti that developed was crazy and playful, much like a Mardi Gras celebration. Graffiti traveled out west. Albuquerque adopted Cholo style. Seattle was similar to New York, but with buses instead of subways. Along with the new cities forming graffiti cultures, pre-existing cultures were changing. New York writers moved out of subways and into the streets. As a result, productions on walls took the place of whole cars on subway trains. Pittsburgh's new generation focused on heavy metal rather than hip-hop. In Miami, heavens were popularized. Magazines dedicated to graffiti became hugely popular. Some examples of these zines include Subway Sun, Graffiti Times, and the International Get Hip Times, or TIGHT. Iron Burners, published out of Cincinnati, was dedicated entirely to freight train graffiti. Originally, graffiti was only created in ink or paint. Two New York writers named Cost and Revs began the practice of wheat pasting. Wheat pasting uses paper glued to buildings using a homemade paste made with, you guessed it, wheat, among other ingredients. Wheat pasting is now an incredibly popular graffiti practice, with artists as famous as Shepard Fairey utilizing it regularly. Throughout the 1990s, graffiti continued to work its way into the mainstream. Books and magazines dedicated to the topic became more and more popular. The first ever graffiti website, Art Crimes, was created by Susan Farrell and Brett Webb. This website is still online today, www.graffiti.org. It quickly became the hub of all graffiti-related media. The concept of street art was not fully formed into the mid to late 90s. It is somewhat different from graffiti in that street artists are commonly professionals, often paid to create outdoor pieces, whereas most graffiti writers are amateurs. However, many street artists are graffiti artists trying to expand the parameters of traditional graffiti. They aim to create something beyond a simple tag, throw-up, or bombing. Some earlier popular street artists include Keith Haring and Jean-Michel Basquiat, both of whom died long before the term street art was coined. Arguably the most famous modern-day street artist is Banksy of London. Street art was particularly on the rise throughout the mid to late 90s. The very late 90s saw a resurgence of bombings and freight paintings throughout most cities. This was an effort to get their name across their entire city, plus other parts of the country. While graffiti is still illegal, it is widely recognized as a true art form. Many writers have been able to make profits from their writing, and some writers have donated profits to charity. Graffiti has undergone a transformation from defacing public property to creating masterpieces that are accessible to the public. American graffiti has endured a remarkable evolution over the decades that it's been in existence. Who knows what's to come for the future? Only time will tell.